Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for our session on the IFRS Taxonomy Deep Dive, the SEC Notice and Taxonomy Review for XBRL providers and data users. For our program today, we have a number of speakers, both from the IFRS and from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have Bartek Saja, Senior Technical Manager at IFRS. He works on the taxonomy at the International Accounting Standards Board. We have Jill Davis, Associate Chief Accountant in the Division of Corporation Finance in the Office of the Chief Accountant at the SEC. We also have Walter Hampshire, Senior IT Program Manager in the Office of Structured Disclosure, also at the SEC. And we have Campbell Pride, President and CEO of XBRL US. For today's session, we're going to be walking you through, we're going to be talking first about the rule itself. We're going to be covering some CPE questions. We will give a demonstration of the IFRS taxonomy, and then a second demonstration covering an IFRS instance document, a sample document. We'll cover questions related to tagging. We'll follow up with some final questions on CPE, and then we have some reference materials that are available to you in the slide deck. So just a few logistical points before we get started. If you have questions, you can click on the Q&A link at the top of your screen and just post questions there, and we'll be taking those in. We'll be taking them throughout the program. We've also queued up many of the questions that we've received from our audience by email. And those will be what we're going to be going through. If you have any kind of technical issues as we go through the program, please just email us at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online again. And also, as I mentioned, we will be doing CPE questions, so for those of you who have requested to receive CPE, please make sure that you respond to the questions as you see them on the screen, and we'll record your responses and get your certificates out to you in the next few weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Campbell Pride. Campbell is going to cover the questions on the rule to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. So we have a couple of questions that people seem to continue to ask, and Jill is with us from the SEC, and she's probably the best one to answer these questions. So Jill, it may be best just to give an overview of who is covered by the rule relative to IFRS, and what do they tag, and what's some of the timing that they should be aware of when they're doing that tagging.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I think it's important to note that what we're kind of focusing on, obviously, is the March 2017 notice of the availability of the IFRS taxonomy that the staff in the commission had published. It applies to all foreign private issuers that prepare their financial statements in accordance with IFRS as issued by the ISB. The notice is available on the Commission's website if you look under, rules, final and notices in rulemaking. But it's also important just to note that this is a follow-up related to the Commission's Rule 33-902 that we adopted back in January 30th, 2009, when we started to require all domestic public companies and foreign private issuers that prepare their financial statements in accordance with the U.S. GAAP, and at that time, foreign private issuers that also prepared their financial statements in accordance with IFRS. However, because the Commission had not specified its taxonomy on its website for IFRS, the staff acknowledged that, and then in 2011, we issued a staff statement that foreign private issuers wouldn't have to prepare and provide interactive data files until such time that the Commission did specify a taxonomy. So that's where we are now. We've specified a taxonomy, and then we've told issuers that they can begin, to voluntarily submit their financial statements on interactive data anytime after March 1st, 2017. Although our existing rules in place would actually require foreign private issuer to start doing it immediately, the Commission provided this notice to let issuers know that they have the ability to first submit their financial data in XBRL with their first annual report on either Form 20F or 40F for the fiscal periods ending on or after December 15, 2017. Typically, interactive data is required at the same time as any other filing at the time it's due. However, in this case, for a company's initial interactive data submission, regardless of the filing type, they have a 30-day grace period. So they can file their, file their Form 20F, and then within 30 days, they can amend the M20F to include the interactive data without having any concerns of timeliness. And so then I guess that begs the question of what is it that they have to actually tag. So in the rule, and if you go to the rule I cited that was issued back in January 2009, or if you go to form requirements and Form 20F, or if you go to Regulation 405, Rule 405 of Regulation ST, it's very clear that they need to tag their complete set of financial statements. So that would be the face of the financial statements as well as the footnotes. And then in addition to that, when there's other required SEC disclosures that have to accompany a set of financial statements, such as the financial statement schedules, those would also have to be tagged. Now, there's certain financial information that doesn't have to be tagged, such as if they're providing additional financial statements under, say, Rule 305 for a significant acquisition or, say, a significant equity method investee. So I think, we do get some questions about, what happens if I file my set of financial statements and then I actually, on my annual report, say on Form 20F or Form 40F, but then I also file that information on a Form 6K. This can be kind of a tricky question sometimes. Form 6K has an instruction under General Instruction C that is clear that there are certain circumstances when you're required to file or provide certain financial statements on 6K. And those scenarios would be, say, subsequent to filing your annual report, you've had a significant change or discontinued operations, or you've adopted a new accounting policy that's reflected kind of in a subsequent period. But usually that really is only going to come up, say, if you're in registration. So if you file your Form 20F and then you've got an interim set of financial statements, and then you're in registration, then there could be this requirement to update your financial statements. So the 6K will talk about that either both in the set terms of an annual financial statement, or if you've gone past, your annual financial statements and a registration statement have gone stale through the passage of time, and then you're kind of at the, say, a 12/31 filer, and you're going to, beginning of October, Form 20F would then require you to provide current interim financial statements that would need tagging. But there are other circumstances where companies do provide financial statements under Form 6K. If you have a unique set of circumstances, I really encourage you to reach out to the Division of Corporation Finance through either their Office of Chief Counsel, or in my office, I work in the Division of Corporation Finance's Office of Chief Accountant. And I think the other thing I'd like to just touch base on kind of before I close is that, there is kind of this question of, okay, well, if I have financial statements and I have financial statement footnotes, what if I'm providing additional financial information in my footnotes? Or what if I'm, cross-referencing from the footnotes to different areas? Say if you have financial instrument type disclosure that you want to avoid duplication. Sometimes that comes up as if it's not actually in the financial statements, do I have to tag it? Well, the answer to that is that if it's required financial statement disclosures to comply with IFRS and the SEC rules, yeah, it has to be tagged irrespective of its location. And then if you have provided additional information in your financial statements that may, that the management thinks is relevant, or they've provided it for, other reasons, the presumption is that if it's in the footnotes, it's in the financial statements, that you would tag it. but I guess there could be some circumstances where you wouldn't, but typically that's the presumption. And if you have a scenario where you think you might not need to tag it, then again, I really encourage you to reach out to us. So I think that's all I really had to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill, for that very comprehensive overview. And I think Jill's touched on all the questions that we've received to date. So Michelle, maybe I can hand it over to you, and you have some CPE questions to ask the participants.
Great, thank you. And actually, before we jump into the CPE questions, it may be a good point to ask. I think that the SEC and both the SEC and the IASB may have disclaimers that they need to make. So if if Jill, if you and Bartek want to just cover your disclaimers quickly, and then we'll go on into CPE questions.
Oh, sure. I'll go ahead. And yeah, I appreciate that. I'm so excited to share the XBRL news. Yeah, all comments that I've made are my remarks. They're not remarks, and they're all my views. They're not remarks or views of the Commission, of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Great, thanks, Jill. And Bartek, do you have a disclaimer?
Yeah, a very short one from my side, that the views expressed in this presentation are mine, and they are not necessarily those of the International Accounting Standards Board or the IFRS Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just jump into those poll questions. So the first poll question, and again, for those of you who are getting CPE, please be sure to click on the button that you think is most appropriate here. The SEC notice on the IFRS taxonomy indicates that foreign private issuers must submit their first filing. Oops, I'm sorry, I need to launch my polling. Let's see. Must submit their filing no later than their first Form 20F or 40F for the fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2017, their first Form 20F or 40F for the fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2018, or there is no mandatory filing requirement. Filing for foreign private issuers is optional. So just click on the button that you think is most appropriate, and then we'll move on from there. And we have one more poll question before we go back to our presentation. Okay, I think we have a lot of people getting CPE, and so I'm just going to give it a second here. Okay, I'm going to end polling in just a minute here. Okay, I'm going to close that out, and we'll go to our next poll question. And actually, I'm having a hard time bringing up my next. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, our second poll question. When foreign private issuers begin filing an XBRL, do they have to submit the XBRL at the same time as the HTML or text submission? The XBRL must be submitted within 30 days of the HTML filing for possible response. The XBRL and HTML must be submitted simultaneously. However, companies can take advantage of an optional 30-day grace period for their initial XBRL submission, regardless of filing type. Or the XBRL must be submitted prior to the HTML filing. So please register your response, and then we'll move back on to our presentation. Okay, and I'm going to end polling in just a second here. It looks like we're getting most of our people in. Okay, great. I'm going to end polling right now. Okay, thanks very much. And now we're going to get rid of the polling and go back to our next section. And we're now going to turn this over to Bartek. And Bartek is going to cover a demonstration of the IFRS taxonomy. And he's going to address a couple of the questions that you see on the screen here. The first one is, what's different and what's the same as the US GAAP taxonomy? And the second, how do I find things in the taxonomy? Where's the face statement line items? Where are table text blocks? So Bartek, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over now to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to share my screen now. Is that visible?
Yes, I can see that now, Bartek. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar, first of all. I've been asked to present a quick high-level demonstration of the IFRS taxonomy. So what you can see on your screens is the IFRS taxonomy, is the presentation link base of the IFRS taxonomy. First of all, in general, the IFRS taxonomy is built quite similarly to the US GAAP taxonomy. The numbers of each section are different, but similarly, we start with the primary financial statement. So the statement of financial position, statement of comprehensive income, statement of cash flows, and then statement of changes in equity. These are the sections that are highlighted. Having said that, we did not want to overload those sections with elements. And we have also set up separate sections for elements that are often used in the primary financial statements, but that are not necessarily required by the IFRS standards. And these are the sections that I'm highlighting now. So sections that between 800, 100 and 800, 400. There is one separate section for each of the primary financial statements. Also, similarly to the US GAAP taxonomy, we have a section with the list of text blocks that are used for tagging of the notes, and that's the section 800, 500 that is highlighted. And we have a section that contains the text blocks for your accounting policies, also to cover that requirement of the SEC tagging. As the first difference, and that's one of the questions that you saw on the screen, and the question that we get a lot, is the question, what about table text blocks? In the US GAAP taxonomy, there is a section or part of the section that covers all the table text blocks. We don't have such a section in the IFRS taxonomy. However, similarly to the US GAAP taxonomy, each and every table in the IFRS taxonomy does have a text block. So I'm scrolling down now to the property, plant, equipment section. As you can see, there is a table for disclosure of detailed information, and 2 rows above it, highlighted now, there is a text block, table text block to tag to that disclosure. As said, each single table does have a text block. The difference is that we don't call our text blocks table text blocks. We just simply call them text blocks. From the XBRL perspective, they are usual text blocks. There's nothing special about them being the table text blocks other than them being used to tag tables. So we've decided we will just stick to the general policy of calling them text blocks. This actually leads me to another difference and another question we get quite a lot, which is what about the domain members for the access? And we have a similar situation here as well. Well, when the US GAAP taxonomy uses the word domain instead of the word member, we simply use the word member. Again, from the XBRL perspective, there is not a difference between this member that is a member and a member that is a domain. In addition, we in the IFRS taxonomy reuse our members for different access. So the property, plant, equipment member here is a domain member for the classes of property, plant, equipment access. However, if I go down, the same property, plant, equipment member for the axis classes of assets is not a domain member anymore. Therefore, we thought putting the domain in the label could be confusing in case you wanted to use that member not as a domain member, but as a simple member on another axis. So these are the main differences. In terms of general architecture, again, size is different of the taxonomies, but apart from the size, we follow generally the same rules or the same patterns. Both taxonomies, our taxonomy and the US GAAP taxonomy, mostly use explicit dimensions. Neither of them uses tuples. As far as I know, the US GAAP taxonomy has recently introduced type dimensions, and they have one type dimension in the 2017 taxonomy. This is certainly something we're considering, but at the moment, neither the 2016 or the 2017 IFRS taxonomy, neither of them uses type dimensions. And I think that's all I wanted to cover as a high-level description. Back to you, unless you have any questions.
Bartek, we do have a question. We've received a few questions, and this one is specific to the, some of them are related to tagging. This one's specific about the taxonomy.
Yep.
Why are line items siblings of tables, unlike the US GAAP taxonomy, where the line item is a child of a table?
That's just a design kind of presentational feature. There is no difference from the XBRL perspective. So, still sharing my screen, I think I am.
Yes, you are.
If I go to any of the tables, we actually have the domain member relationship in the definition link base. So it does not matter whether line item element and its children are on the level of the table or are children of the table. We don't see any practical difference between those two approaches.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, well, I think if you could stop sharing your screen, I'm going to come back to the slides.
Yes, sure, I have stopped.
Great, thank you. Okay, just bear with me a second here. Okay, and now, actually, we're going to have a demonstration of the instance of an IFRS instance document, and I'm going to turn it over to Walter Hampshire. And Walter, I think that you have a disclaimer that you may want to cover as well. Walter, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, because there was like a window covering the thing up.
Oh, sorry.
No, not your fault. Just poor screen management on my part. Yeah, the SEC is a matter of policy disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views expressed are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or of the author's colleagues on the staff of the Commission. I believe you need to stop screen. Oh, you did.
I've just done that.
I'm going to share my screen, and I'm wondering what's going to happen to this Zoom window with its participant pane and all that jazz. All right, where is it? Share my screen. Share the screen. All right, and it minimized everything else. Well, that's good. Okay, so here's what I'd like to start with. This is an anonymized version of an actual IFRS filing to the SEC that did not have XBRL in it because it was an IFRS filing. As you can see, there's a giant disclaimer at the top. There is no such country as San Lorenzo. There is no such company as Azul, et cetera, et cetera. The numbers are fake, but it is actually taken literally from an actual filing in the hopes that by looking at that and actually modeling that, we can actually see some of the edge cases, if you will, the sort of thing that I think people have actually been asking about. It's not the whole thing because it's a rather large filing, but here's the basic idea. There's a cover page, and there are certain things on the cover page that do need to be tagged within the instance document, mainly for the purpose of integration with Edgar. So to take an example, you're going to be tagging the registrant name. The registrant name is going to appear in the instance document, and it has to appear there in exactly the same way that it appears in the Edgar standing data. So a number of those things appear on the face, on the first page, the cover. So that's what we call the cover, and we call the cover tagging. Some of those elements are required, others obviously optional. Now you'll notice that here's this white space right here. That white space represents, several hundred pages of management discussion, all the other items that are actually in the requirements of a Form 20F. So we skipped all the way, in a sense here, all the way to item 18, which is where you put your financial statements. And none of that had to be tagged. So we got cover page and has some stuff needing to be tagged. You can skip over that and you go straight to the financial statements. All right, and here's an ordinary looking IFRS statement. One of the first things that you notice is you have a column of numbers here. You're not going to be tagging those numbers. Okay, those numbers are references to footnotes. You do not need to tag them. You do not need to put in footnote links. Nothing like that. The focus here is on our headings and our financial reported numbers. Okay, so here's our liabilities and equity, income by function, et cetera, et cetera. Equity statement, cash flow, all the usual things you might expect. And here is what we're going to be tagging. I've taken just a portion of note 1, which is the general information. And you'll notice that the general information has, for example, here's a number here, which is the common shares, and it's got to be the same numbers on the cover. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Similarly, we have notes in here about who owns this company. So there's a majority owner, and how many employees are there. So we'll come back to that too. Here's the statement of accounting policies, which is one large note that is actually logically broken up into several individual policies. And finally, we have a note in which there's really not a lot of text, but there is this table and there are numbers within the table that are going to need to be tagged. Okay, so now you know what I'm going to show you in the XBRL filing itself. All right, so let's see if I can get to the right filing here. Standard taxonomies. Oh, that's interesting. Where is mine? Oh, that was Chrome. Okay, so when you tag for Edgar, there's a rule in the Edgar Filer Manual, Rule 6.7.12, which tells you how to arrange your roles in your schema file in such a way that it'll come out with the following kind of hierarchy. There will be a cover, there will be each of the individual financial statements, there will be the top level of notes, which are called the level 1 block tag notes. Then there's what we call the level 2 notes. In this case, it's just the accounting policies. Level 3, which are tables, and finally, the details, the individual numbers, amounts that are tagged in the notes. If we were to look back at the actual schema file itself, you will see that here we have, we're defining all of our own roles. The significance of this is that, as Bartek was saying about the numbers that appear in the IFRS taxonomy, in the role definitions and their text, and what doesn't matter, okay, because you're essentially not going to be using those in your filing. What you're going to do is you're going to create a custom schema for every filing. All right, so here we are. Here's our company. There's the file name, .xsd. You're going to have your own link bases. You can't refer to any of the IFRS link bases. All you can really do is refer to the IFRS schema. All right, so here we have our definitions. We have to import some other schemas. Now, there's a question that came up about what other taxonomies are you actually allowed to reference. Well, here's the one you have to reference. Okay, so at this point we have our 2016 taxonomy. That's the namespace of that taxonomy, and this is the URL where you get it from. You can also use any of the standard SEC taxonomies that are allowed by the Edgar Taxonomies page. So for example, here we have the currency taxonomy for 2017. The place to find those things is on what's called the standard taxonomies page. And basically, think of it as anything that's listed here as being a recent schema, you can actually go ahead and use. Now, this comes to one of the most interesting questions. This is, if I'm an IFRS filer, can I use the US GAAP taxonomy? Okay, here's the way we answer that question. If your disclosure requirement somewhere in your notes or on your face financials requires you to report a US GAAP number, then you're going to be using the US GAAP taxonomy. If you have to file a schedule that is required on your 20F in your reporting requirements, and that requires US GAAP, then you will be required. Most of the time, though, the only other taxonomies you're going to need are the DEI taxonomy, the Document Entity Integration taxonomy. That's the thing that helps us integrate with Edgar. Sometimes what we call the Invest taxonomy. It has a few random elements having to do with schedules of investment and whatnot. And a new taxonomy that none of you have seen yet, which we are going to call the Common Reporting Taxonomy. The Common Reporting Taxonomy is going to take certain things out of the US GAAP taxonomy and the IFRS taxonomy and create a single name for those things. If you want a rule of thumb about what will go into that Common Reporting Taxonomy, the main things that I'm thinking of at this point are first of all, the axes that have the identical name, right? So the range axis, okay, that goes in the Common Reporting Taxonomy. Anything having to do where its members are entities of some sort, right? Legal entities or consolidation entities, anything like that, anything that reflects the structure of the company rather than a specific standard, those will go into a Common Reporting Taxonomy. And there's maybe a couple of others, but that's the basic idea. The things which are not specific to the accounting standard that are axes, or that are things which are SEC only requirements and aren't really US GAAP or IFRS requirements, we want to put those into a common taxonomy. I apologize profusely for not being able to show you a draft of that, but take my word for it. The basic idea here is that we're going to keep the names as similar as possible, and we're going to provide plenty of examples in which you will be able to see essentially how to get from what you're doing today to what you're going to do in the future. There will be a nice long transition phase of some duration during which US GAAP filers are probably not going to have to do much of anything. Eventually, though, we do want to consolidate on a common taxonomy. Okay, so enough about the common taxonomy. Those of you with a great deal of curiosity may have already been looking at the screen here and see that I've defined a few extra elements, custom elements. So that answers the question of like, okay, can you extend the IFRS taxonomy? Well, yes, in order to actually satisfy the requirements for the SEC filing, you do have to extend sometimes, and sometimes in ways that are brought up, in fact, by the sort of questions that Bartek was asked. So let's come back to what that actually is going to involve. All right, so here's the way we've tagged it. These are cover page items. There's your statement of financial position. Everything in the renderer, the SEC renderer, is going to work essentially the same as it does for US GAAP. So if you look at a cash and cash equivalents item, okay, now you're just looking at that element, and you're looking at the documentation string that was referred to by Bartek in his piece of the presentation. Same thing with income by function, comprehensive income, statement of equity. The layout here, those of you familiar with XBRL and the renderer, will know that there's actually a special axis that contains these items along the top. Those are special members of a special axis called the components of equity. And it may naturally occur to you, well, gee, if that's a US GAAP taxonomy axis, how is this going to work in IFRS? Well, never fear. These concepts like share capital and treasury shares and shares, these are all actually accounting concepts. And so therefore that axis is going to be, you're going to use the axis for the statement of equity that is in the IFRS taxonomy. You do not need to go borrow the one from US GAAP, and it's not something we would put into a common taxonomy. So we've already modified the renderer, and we'll be deploying that shortly so that in fact we'll do this. Now that's a lot of text and a lot of words about something that may seem obscure, but the general principle I'm trying to get across here is some of these things really are, they're reporting concepts, they're accounting standard specific, and therefore they're going to stay in whatever taxonomy they live in today, okay? And you're going to continue to use them from there. And finally, we have our cash flow methods. One of the things I want to stop and point out here is one of the rules that we have in the Edgar system, which is looked at internally, and we care about it a lot, and we've actually written comment letters about it, is how it is that the calculation link base corresponds to this presentation. Okay, so Edgar is not going to reject your filing if you don't have it exactly right. But I do want to show you essentially how it works in a case like this with a realistic example. So here we have, if you're familiar with the notion of comprehensive income and non-controlling interests, I know you all are, of course. You know that there's actually two ways that you can break down the notion of comprehensive income. Okay, so one of them says, I have comprehensive income, and that consists of my period profit or loss, and then a whole bunch of other stuff, that adjustments and whatnot, other comprehensive income. You add those things up and you get comprehensive income. But the other thing you have to do in your reporting is to also break it down by which portion of the profit and which portion of the comprehensive income was attributable to the parent, to the owners of the parent entity versus its non-controlling interests. So here's what we're doing. You'll notice that we only had one presentation group for the consolidated statement of comprehensive income. We have one set of calculation links underneath it, but we also have another role here, another role that has no presentation with it. Its only purpose is to have these additional calculation links for profit and loss and comprehensive income. If you didn't have these, you actually would get warnings if you were running it through various other validators, not Edgar itself, but it would warn you that you were violating 6.15.2. This is one of the more obscure areas, but I want to assure you that this is the sort of thing that I mean when I say, if it's in the Edgar Filer Manual, it applies equally to both US GAAP and IFRS filings. Right? There's no real exceptional cases of any kind. If it says it's a rule for the US GAAP filing, then it's a rule also for the IFRS filing. Okay, coming back to our sample here. Here's our general information. Right, so this is an enormous text block consisting of at least a portion of the original general information. And you can see what it is. There's actually a disclosure of general information about financial statements. Often these things end with the word explanatory, and that's a naming convention within the IFRS taxonomy that's very helpful for finding things that are generally going to be shown as top-level notes. All right, summary of significant accounting policies. Here we have, again, explanatory, and that's your summary. So these are almost always going to be the same because IFRS statements pretty much look that way all the time. Here's cash and cash equivalents. Anybody want to guess what the name of the block is here? Oh, yes, disclosure of cash and cash equivalents explanatory. Okay, so the correspondence between the title, the typical name of that note, and the text block tag that you use is going to be pretty straightforward. Now things get a little odd here, okay? Because, and I've constructed this example deliberately to show how this is supposed to work. If I look at note 1, there's not a lot of numbers in here, but there are a few, and there's certainly no tables. So in the case of note 1, you are going to skip from level 1 tagging all the way down to level 4 tagging. And you're just going to tag those individual numbers and provide just enough presentation information to lay it out in a sort of a table like this. This presentation doesn't particularly matter, and it's often the case that people will use a term like general information narrative to indicate that these are numbers that appeared in the original text. Okay, so once again, you do that in US GAAP, you do that in IFRS. Now about some significant accounting policies. Here we have the top level, but then we have the next level down. In the next level down, you can have a presentation group that has several individual policies. And once again, there's a nice convention that the folks at IFRS use, disclosure of the basis of consolidation explanatory. Okay, so here it is, the basis of consolidation. And here we have the transactions with non-controlling interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, these labels don't particularly matter because they're merely labeling something which is fundamentally a chunk of text. You can put all those into a single presentation group, but you do need to break up what was the original. All right, so here we had 2.2, and here's 2.22, 2.23, 2.24, and so on. Obviously, I left out numbers, 3 through whatever, 21. And finally, we have our cash and cash equivalents example. Now, once again, here's our top level text block. Within the top level text block, then you have a table. And the table actually needs to be tagged separately. Now, you may wonder why it is that we ask for level 3 tagging of a table text block. The reason is so that you don't have to try particularly hard to make your presentation link base at the detail level look just like this. Okay, because that's sort of impossible anyway. But the basic idea is this is supposed to accompany the detail tagging in the next level and give you a presentation of it. And there certainly are notes that have several different tables in them. Now, here's our cash and cash equivalents at the top level. Then we have our cash equivalents table. See how it's different? We just tag just the table portion. So the narrative that came before it, the title of it, that's not there. And once again, here we have a case that, oops, we had to create an extension. So the question, the bewilderment, I can feel it coming through. I'm not even looking at the Q&A, and I know that there's just incredible bewilderment. You mean, Walter, you had to create an extension in order to get a level 3 text block because it wasn't in the IFRS taxonomy? Yes, I had to create an extension element. And look what it looks like, right? It's a disclosure of cash and cash equivalents. You call it a table text block because that makes it obvious what it is. You give it a type of text block item type. This happens all the time in US GAAP tagged financials. Okay, so it shouldn't be too unusual to think that that's going to happen in IFRS. Is it necessary? Is this an excuse to always do it? Well, no. Bartek actually said, no, there are actually disclosures that sometimes are compound of several other explanatory notes or disclosures, and you do need to go look for one. But if you've already got something which is a note about cash and cash equivalents, and now you just have to disclose some table that in this case happens to be about foreign currencies, if there isn't any such thing, yeah, you do need to come up with a reasonable name and use it consistently period to period in order to tag that portion of the note. And then finally we have, you saw the general information here. Here's our cash and cash equivalents. Now, this is what I meant when I said you don't really need to try and make your presentation look exactly like the original because that's sort of impossible with the rendering engine. But here's what we can do. Notice that all of these were actually dollar amounts, but that the dimension along which they were being decomposed was actually a currency. Okay, so we actually had a member here. There was the currency axis, which didn't exist and therefore had to create it, and the currency underscore USD, that came from the currency taxonomy. So if we were to go back and look at the taxonomy, which we're actually not going to do, the custom taxonomy, you'd see that what we have here is a presentation group that just says, okay, cash and cash equivalents is essentially dimensionalized by one axis, and it's going to be decomposed along this. And we created an other currencies element because there is no other currencies member in the currency taxonomy. Okay, so this actually answers a question that we got, I believe, in one of these slides that's coming up. This is how you do it, because these are the dollar amount being reported is in US dollars. So therefore, the other thing is clearly a dimension. Now, one of the last questions that people, I believe, ask has to do with the inline version of this. Whoops. And yes, there is indeed an inline version of this. And you're going to wonder, well, when do we like get to see that? When do we actually see this thing out on the SEC website? As you might be able to tell if you're familiar with the Inline Viewer, this is an updated viewer, and it's doing something a little different than it usually did because it brought up the entire filing for us to look at while it was loading. And you can see now that it's highlighting each of the individual facts. There's your fiscal year ended. Here's your registrant name. And so this will be published at some point. It's still simply going through the internal approval process. We don't put things on our website until enough people have looked at them and edited them and made sure that we're not doing anything wrong. But it is exactly the example. The example that you just saw, the rendered example, is exactly the same as what came out of this, what was extracted from this inline sample. So you're going to get both. It is not required that you use inline. It is just the way we chose to demonstrate it. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Back to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks very much, Walter. That was great and really helpful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. And I'm going to turn it over to Campbell to walk us through the next set of questions.
Thanks, Michelle. I think thank you for that, Walter. We have a number of questions which I know you've gone through and tried and answered. So I think the first set of questions we had to Michelle, we can just quickly breeze through these. All of these are pretty much addressed. The only question on that we haven't addressed is which link bases are required, which I think is pretty obvious, but you may just want to answer that. If Walter's on mute, I can answer it for him.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading the questions. Okay, so EDGAR restrictions on XBRL instance document syntax. Well, the restrictions are the sort of thing that you will find in the EDGAR filer manual. Here's one of them that sometimes causes confusion. Silence phone. For example, we only use segments in context. We do not use scenarios. And you say, well, gosh, the IFRS taxonomy uses scenarios. Well, it doesn't matter because it uses scenarios in its link bases and we're not using its link bases. So that doesn't matter. There are many other restrictions. You definitely need to be familiar with the EFM and run it through validators and so on to see what sorts of things you're not allowed to do. I think I covered namespaces. There aren't any required link bases per se, although you do generally find that you're going to need 4 link bases for every filing, right? You're going to need your presentation, your labels, your calculation, and your definitions. There are restrictions on the syntax of link bases. You'll find that actually they're not particularly onerous. They're sort of natural restrictions. They sort of are preventing you from doing things that you would look at and they would just be kind of weird anyway. So generally people don't find those particularly a problem. I talked about the consolidation items and entities. The general point here is we're going to try and create a common reporting taxonomy in which any axis whose members are entities, be they consolidation items or entities, are the same. And the reason should be obvious. If you're consuming this data, you don't really want to have 2 different methods for detecting the fact that you're looking at a consolidated entity versus something else when that's not really part of the standard. Similarly for range axis, and I talked about the equity component axis. It turns out equity components are an accounting concept, and so therefore they live in their home taxonomy. Units are the same. I would say, I'll confess that the EDGAR filer manual, was kind of late to the game in terms of giving guidance around units. There's some pretty good guidance about units on the XBRL US website, but the general point is you should really look for what you want in the UTR and use that in preference to making up your own names.
Okay, thank you, Walter. Michelle, if we could go to the next slide, please. There's this one question on the whether the document that you just showed will be made available, and I think you already answered that. So the next question was, is going to any differences on impact when rendering when using the IFRS taxonomy?
There's not supposed to be. All right, so a couple of folks have already detected some issues with the current version of the rendering engine that are triggered by it. We are working to fix those, and we're going to be deploying a new one as soon as we can get all those fixes done and deployed in Edgar. There's not supposed to be any difference.
Okay, great, thank you. Michelle, can you just click ahead 2 slides? I think we've answered we've answered these questions here. If we go to the next slide, please. Just in terms of, can you clarify the naming conventions for L1, 2, and L3, in which sections of the 2009 ruling that these can be found?
The 2009 ruling called it, basically they were just calling block text tagging. The rule was actually a mixture of rules about what to tag based on where it is in the document, kind of mixed in with rules about how to, what to tag based on the content. So it can be confusing, but the basic idea that comes out of that is that level 1 means the detail of the face financials and 1 text block per note. Level 2 is specifically about the individual accounting policies, and then level 3 is each individual table that appears within the notes. So those terms do not appear in the 2009 ruling, but you'll see that the equivalent language around, block tagging of tables, that language does appear.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question related to the formula link base for the IFRS filings. Is this going to be used by the SEC?
You mean the IFRS taxonomy, the formula link base that accompanies the IFRS filings? No.
Yeah.
Although, once again, there's some, very useful intellectual property in there and useful functionality in terms of the quality of your filing. It's just that that's not something that Edgar is going to do. It's not going to use it from the IFRS filings.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll skip to the next slide, please, Michelle. I think we answered the question around the disclosures. And finally on the text blocks, and I think we covered a number of these, so maybe talk a little bit, text blocks listed under this is the notes section, IFRS. Are they supposed to be used exclusively for level 1? In your example, you created an extension, but can those be used for table text blocks, for example?
Yeah, I think once again, I think one of the things you have to understand, if you're familiar with the US GAAP taxonomy, the IFRS taxonomy it's very much like a book. It's like, it looks like the original standard itself. It decomposes in very much the same way, sort of topically, when it comes to the notes. And that's why you see such crisp naming conventions around sort of what level of disclosure are we talking about. Always remember that when you're choosing a tag, the first and foremost things that you should be thinking about is, what is the disclosure requirement that the piece of text or number in the filing that you're tagging, what is the disclosure requirement that it's satisfying? And that generally will rather quickly disambiguate what it is you're actually, what tag you should be using. It'll also tell you that, maybe you are disclosing something which, is just simply too fine-grained or is only part of something that the IFRS taxonomy has. And we would prefer, well, let me just leave it at that. If you start from that, you'll realize very quickly that where something appears in the presentation link base of the IFRS taxonomy, it's helpful, but it's certainly not normative.
Right. Michelle, can we just skip ahead to slide 13? I think we've answered this question here on the the foreign exchange. And this question has come up the next question on the next slide, Michelle, has come up a couple of times related to some of the data types. And then maybe after we've answered this question, we could jump to the CPE questions. So this is the question. We've noticed a number of string types used for IFRS, whereas in the US GAAP, things like the period life of assets or intangible assets has got a duration type. However, in the US GAAP taxonomy, there's string item types. Maybe you can comment on this.
Yeah, let me back up to a general point I want to make here, because I noticed that some of the questions being asked in text are like this.
Yeah.
In the sense that they're saying, like, where does the guidance for extensions come from? All right. The Edgar Filer Manuals, section 5 and 6, that relate to XBRL are a set of constraints and guidance around your instance and your extension, okay? And it doesn't matter where the base taxonomy was. So there's this thing called the risk return taxonomy for mutual fund filings. The same rules that apply that are essentially either a style guide, a suggested style, or actual syntax constraints are from the EFM. They don't arise from the individual taxonomy. So the same principle applies here. So if somebody noticed, for example, that I created a table text block, and instead of following the IFRS convention, I called it, table text block. Well, that's because, and I could be wrong, but I believe there's actually a piece of section 6.8 in the EFM that says, essentially what's the naming convention you want to follow. It has nothing to do with US GAAP, it's what the EFM says. Now, as far as that goes, what you're seeing here, this question is the same kind of question. If you look at the EFM, if it says that if you're reporting a duration, and the disclosure requirement is to report a duration, and the duration could be expressed in years or anything else, then between the EFM guidance and the UTR validation, you don't really have much of a choice. You should not be using decimal extensions for that. You should be using a duration item type, unless the requirement is specifically, you must disclose this in days or in years. Now, I believe that that's actually sort of unusual. I believe that they don't actually usually say you must disclose the number of months or something. They don't tell you what units of time you're supposed to disclose something in. That's why you should be extending using the guidance in the EFM, which in this case says duration item type.
Okay, great. Thank you, Walter. So Michelle, just for time, could we, and I think we've covered most of the stuff for the CPE questions, is it possible to skip to the final set of CPE questions?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, let me bring up the third polling question. And again, this is for people who are looking for CPE. And the question is that you can see on your screen here is foreign private issuers were not required to begin filing in 2009 because one, the FPIs needed a longer grace period. Two, the SEC had not yet approved it for use, the taxonomy for use. Or three, there was no demand for foreign private issuer financial data in XBRL format. So click on the button that you think is most appropriate, and then we'll record your scores. So we're gonna shut this down in just a couple of seconds here. So if you can just make sure that you click on the option that you think is most appropriate. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end polling for that. And now we'll go to our last CPE question. Detail tagging of footnotes must be provided by foreign private issuers immediately with the initial filing submitted in XBRL format. Second option with the third filing submitted in XBRL format, or third option with the second filing submitted in XBRL format. So click on the option that you think is most appropriate to record your participation. So we're going to close this down in just a few seconds here. So please make sure that you record your response if you're interested in getting CPE credit. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and close that down. And I'll turn it back to you, Campbell, if you want to do, I don't know if you want to do one or two more questions.
Yeah, so I think we've probably got time just for one final question, and maybe this is a good one for Bartek, if Bartek's still on, and this question being asked live, is just in the US GAAP taxonomy there is a domain member is used, but in the IFRS taxonomy that does not exist. And maybe Bartek, you could just explain why, just so people get confused with seeing that.
Yes, it is true that we're not using domain in the label, but the elements are, can be used in the same way as they are when they have the domain in the US GAAP taxonomy. If you look at the definition link base, and I could if I share the screen. I don't know. I'm trying to share the screen, but can I?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, so
Screen now, Bartek.
Is it on?
Yep.
Yeah, so if you look at the definition link base of the IFRS taxonomy, the property plan equipment here is a dimension domain, arcrow. So you can see that it is a domain for this particular table, but it does not have to be a domain in other tables. So if I open the other use of that, so you can see here for the classes of assets axis, the same member is just a member, it's not a domain. So we're using the same members. Once it can be used as a domain member, once it can be used as a normal member. Therefore, we don't use domain in the label. And I know the US taxonomy does use the domain, but it should not matter. If you take our property plan and equipment member, put it into your taxonomy and put it as a domain member, it will be a domain member for any given axis you put it as a domain member into. So it should not matter that we don't use the domain in the label.
Okay, thank you, Bartek. So we're at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank all the speakers today. I'd like to thank Bartek from IFRS, Jill Davis from the Office of the Chief Accountant and the Division of Corporate Finance, and Walter Hampshire from the SEC in the Office of Structured Disclosure. So thank you very much today. This webinar will be available. There were a number of questions that we didn't have time to get to today. We do plan to do another webinar next month, so we'll be able to address all those additional questions, the number of questions that you had written in. Walter and I have answered some of them, not all of them, but we'll roll those over into the next next webinar and then get most of those addressed. So thank you everyone for attending today, and we look forward to you joining the next webinar, and we will send out the details of that in the next week.
Thank you, Campbell.
Thank you.